Hi, everyone. Welcome to Aderaba, Jewish Studies on the Contrary.
I'm Gilah Kletenik, and I'm here with my co-host, Rafe Neis.
So today, Gilah, thought we were going to unpack the beloved notion that humans are created in God's image, exploring both positives and the downsides of that somewhat uniquely, but also not uniquely Jewish notion.
That's right. In fact, I believe this episode is entitled, What's Wrong with Being in God's Image?
And what is wrong, Gilah? What's wrong with being in God's image?
Honestly,
You tell me.
honestly, this, I think, amongst all our episodes, is the toughest one for me
Interesting.
because I have a confession to make.
Hmm.
I have a complicated past.
Oh,
I used to be a real proponent of the notion of Tselem Elohim, the idea from Genesis that humans are created in the image or the likeness of God. In my work as a rabbi and teacher, these are texts and ideas that I actually really love to unpack and theorize with different kinds of students, and I found that notion really very powerful.
can you say more about how you found it powerful and why it's complicated? Like, why is this? Tell me more about the complicated past.
Oh, the complicated parts, or are
Your
you
complicated past.
Oh, my complicated
Yes.
past.
Were you once an image of God and are you now an image of the devil incarnate? Is that what's happened?
Maybe it would be the image of Lilith if I had to choose
There we go.
some demonic figure. But in all seriousness, before we even get to some of the more the complications of the idea, I want to lead with actually what I used to find very compelling about it.
Okay.
And I think there are really two elements. The first is what happens when we contextualize this idea of Tselem Elohim, being in the image of God, within its ancient Near Eastern context. And various scholars, including possibly most prominently Nahum Sarna in his JPS commentary, underscore how this idea contrasts with those promoted by other Mesopotamian and Egyptian contexts, wherein the notion of being in the image of God was exclusive to the king or the pharaoh. And the idea that these scholars suggest is that what Hebrew scripture is doing is it's coming along and it's democratizing this notion. All humans are created in the image of God, not simply a king or a pharaoh.
Hmm.
And parenthetically, and this isn't addressed by those scholars, but we actually also see in certain texts in the New Testament where Jesus specifically is portrayed as being in the image of God to the exclusion of or in contrast with other humans. And so I personally always took pride, I would say, even in the equalizing democratic notion of Hebrew scripture in Genesis, which appears first in the first chapter of Genesis, then again in the fifth chapter, and then again in the ninth chapter, that all humans are created in the image of God. That's one element.
Right. I mean, I want to stop you for a second, Gila, because I feel like the minute we hear these self-congratulatory, look, the Goyim, they were monarchists and they only used image of God for the kings, but look, the Israelites or the whatever layer this Tselem Elohim is, if you want to go for the idea.
Elohis, probably.
Right. Actually, no, I think it's priestly. It's priestly, actually, because
Well, certainly in the ninth chapter. But yes, I think I don't
no,
know about the fifth. Okay, we
yeah, we can get into it. But Genesis 1 is
is
supposedly
yes,
priestly.
Genesis one is, but
Okay, this is just folks who are listening, this particular scholarship, a scholarly school that attributes various strata of the Bible to different authors. But
groups of
let's
authors.
groups of authors. Let's back away from that. I guess the minute I hear the sort of the Israelites or the pre-T authors take something that in the ambient Middle East is a monarchist idea and democratize it, I get a little suspicious. I'll say that just because of how conveniently self-congratulatory it is. However, and of course, because of the problematic Orientalist trope, which is in a way, I think, a very Christian move to make even the Hebrew Bible the better version of what you find in the rest of ancient Middle Eastern culture. It's a reflex that's been taken up also by Jewish scholars. But let's put that aside. At the same time, I do vibe with your distinction between the Christian idea that is actually spelled out, especially in the New Testament, but in early Christian literature, that the image of God suffered damage or what's called a fall, and therefore required another image of God, i.e., Jesus, who's God's image incarnate, to restore it. I definitely find myself troubled by that idea without necessarily feeling married to the idea that all humans are in the image of God. So I guess I think that maybe it's fair to share that I myself have a sordid history, not that sordid, but used to really find the idea of humans being in the image of God very tantalizing. And that was less about the ways that it democratized all humans and less about the ways that it endowed humans with sanctity and more about what it meant for the other side of the equation, which maybe we'll get to later, which is if humans are in God's image, and I'm, as you know, a huge literalist, I take that very seriously. And so I used to be very fond of those, especially early rabbinic traditions that took it very literally and basically understood that if you want to know what God looks like, look in the mirror. And those traditions understood that God has a body that coincidentally, of course, because of this idea of humans being a kind of copy of God's body, looks like a human body. Two legs, right? And there are actually early Jewish mystical accounts that even give you the measurements of God's body parts. So there is that. That's fascinating, that tradition to me.
Right, that Shior Koma literature,
Hmm.
that early Kabbalistic text. But of course, all of that is rooted in the first chapter of Ezekiel, which
Cool.
really turns this on its head, right? If Genesis tells us that humans are created in the image of God, in Ezekiel, we're actually told that it describes God as Demut Kisei Vial Demut Hakisei Demut Kimare Adam Alav Milamala, right? That God is actually described in this vision of Ezekiel as looking like a human. And it flips it. Really, it's the total inverse of the notion that humans are created in the image of God. Here, it's almost like humans, it's telling us what's obvious, which is that humans in us really are the ones creating God in their own image.
That's already a much more deep, that already is like a metaphoricizing it, to which, as you know, I'm a literalist, but yes. And that will get to that idea that is it a coincidence that humans attribute divine form to human form kind of thing? And we'll talk about that later.
Spoiler alert, it's not a coincidence.
Thank you. Thanks, Gilah. We both clearly like to be not just literal, but heavy handed. Some of us, of course, are light wristed, but that's a whole other thing. So let's just get back to, in a way, the stakes for many people, because I, in many of the circles in which I circulate in circles, so I'm sort of twirling around.
Maybe a
I,
thesaurus would
yeah,
help you.
on the contrary, I like the idea of the kind of circle within circle metaphor. But I hear the notion of Tselem Elohim used a lot, and it's used, I find, often by Jews, right? The image of God, too surprisingly, but also by sort of you hear it a little bit sometimes in Christian circles too, and it's used often to uphold egalitarian, inclusive impulses, right? To say we should recognize the rights or we should embrace all ex humans because they, like us, are in God's image, right? So there's a kind of religious based call of equality and liberty, and you might say even liberation. So that's one of the places that I hear it often even described, and others who have taught or with whom I've spoke will know that I point this out, that so often communities, liberal or even left radical communities, will cite Tselem Elohim, the idea that humans are in the image of God, along with another principle, tikkun olam, or mending the world, as the two most important principles in Judaism. And they will often use it to support a liberal or left sort of political vision of justice.
Yeah, and I am sympathetic to that, right? And when I hear that reduction, like that emphasis on Judaism of Tselem Elohim,
Mm.
Instead of thinking, oh my God, where did that come from? I'm actually reminded of Bereshit Rabbah, a midrash, a 5th century midrash. And I'm also reminded of a similar text in the Yerushalmi of the Palestinian Talmud, where actually Ben Azai, the sage, tells us that points to what is the most important verse in all of Hebrew scripture, and he points to Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of human. Biyom baro Elohim Adam b'dmim asa oto. That on the day in which God created human in God's image. And he says, Zek klal gadol b'Torah. This is a fundamental principle in Judaism. And so I think they have legs on which to stand. They are at least in the spirit of Ben Azai in saying as much. And so to return to, my earlier comment when I said there were two things that I found really generative and animating about Tselem Elohim, this is the second. The notion that humans, it comes with this notion of humans being created in the image of God, is not just the democratizing and equalizing, but the notion of human dignity. Irres-
Yeah, go ahead.
irrespective of who a person is and where they come from, and even what they've done to you, they are deserving of a certain degree of respect and dignity. And the Midrash actually brings this Ben Azai comment next to Rabbi Akiva's comment, where Rabbi Akiva tells us the most important verse is V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that you should love your fellow like yourself. And Ben Azai is clearly coming and telling us, actually, there's something a bit too reciprocal in that element, or maybe there's something that comes before that, and that is this base level. And it's not for naught that human rights organizations like B'Tselem literally broadcast that notion, that to uphold human dignity and human equality, they're leaning on that idea.
Salem is, for folks who may not know, an Israeli human rights organization. It's interesting because the same Ben Azai is also supposed to have used the idea of B'Tselem Elohim to say that if you don't engage in, let's call it, reproduction or sex that leads to offspring, it's like murder and defacing God. And what's funny, of course, is that then a fellow rabbi says, very nice of you to say so. This is elsewhere, but you yourself are not married. And Ben Azai is like, what can I do? I desire Torah. Let the world be continued by the others having sex. And so there's something, this is already where you start to see some, let's just say, pronatalists. There are these material, pragmatic, potential, almost like policy effects that could flow from it. But then the proponent of those policies himself exempts himself from it. I guess I want to.
Which
Go ahead, please.
Which I was going to say is, first of all, just I love that. I love that self-reflection. And secondly, I do think it's worth noting that even that idea might be based on the third mention of the notion of Tselem Elohim, which comes in the context of actually discussing murder. That a human who kills another human, their blood should be spilled, right? Who spills another's blood. Why? Ki b'tselem Elohim asa Adam, right? Because humans are created in the image of God. And that is really the root of the connection between Tselem Elohim, human dignity and human rights, and also what Ben Azai in that other text might also be leaning on and thinking of murder, because it makes that explicit connection between.
Yes, and Ben Azai cites those verses. Right. So yeah, the Bible itself. But the thing is, of course, that the murder of humans is sacrosanct, and that sets up a hierarchy, of course, of beings. What were you going to say?
I was actually going to say, why don't you tell us more about the dark side?
So the dark side actually is, I can give you an example, again, using the rabbis against themselves, which is another place that you see the mention of the image of God is by our friend Rabbi Akiva, and that's in the Mishnah, the Tractate Avot. And he says that actually it's a mark of belovedness that humans are created in the image of God, and it's told to them. That is, the Bible not only does God do it, but the Bible tells humans about this. But then Rabbi Akiva transitions, moving from the belovedness of humans above all species. I think that's important. To, guess what? The belovedness or the
Yeah, I think
Yeah. Yeah, like
belovedness. Yeah,
maybe even favored. There's a kind of favorite. There's a favoriteness of Israel, that is, Israelites or Jews, who are called God's children. And he cites another verse. So, what you start to see is among all species, the human is beloved. And among all humans, Israelites, that is, the children of Israel, Jews are beloved. And you start to see this actually become more and more explicit, I think, in rabbinic literature. And you don't see the principle of Tselem Elohim used to uphold all human dignity. You see Tselem Elohim potentially behind the idea that murder, it's true, is defacing God's image. But when the rabbis want to think about human dignity outside of Jews, you don't see them invoking the principle of Tselem Elohim. So it's sort of this. I actually would even say it doesn't do that much work, except for the fact that a few rabbis are like, it's so important. You don't really see it operationalized outside of procreation, actually, or
Right.
murder.
And I think that's interesting because there is another principle that actually does loom more in rabbinic literature, and that's the notion of kavod habriot,
Mhm,
which is literally translated as, the honor of creatures or creations. And we see
mhm,
that that actually does have halachic implications. So we see in Brachot 19b, Gadol kavod habriot shedocha lo ta'aseh batorah, that the principle of kavod habriot, dignity or honor to creatures, is so significant that it can actually push aside a negative commandment in the Torah. And this does have halachic implications.
mhm.
Shatnez is the example there in Brachot, but Tselem Elohim does not show up
Right.
with halachic implication in rabbinic literature,
And
as
it's
far
worth,
as far as I know.
I think that's true. And I think well, there's one place that it actually it does show up around procreation.
Procreation. I was going to say to the
And
exclusion of.
And I want to say that as the rabbis develop it in the Babylonian Talmud, which is sort of one of the later rabbinic compilations, they start to make it a Jewish thing. That is, by the time you get to Ketubot, they start to use Tselem Elohim to talk about the amount of Israelite births that have to happen for the Messiah to come. So it becomes not a humanistic procreative driver, but a specifically pro-natalist kind of a motivation for Jewish procreation. So that's already interesting. And I wanted to say that the other thing, which of course you've said this in passing and right now, and I want to just emphasize it, that the principle of kavod, honor, dignity, respect for creatures is usually extended to humans, but the term briot doesn't have to be necessarily just human. It literally means creatures or creations, right? Everything is a creation. A tree is a creation. An animal is a creation. So to the extent that yes, it is usually used to talk about humans and not animals, it emphasizes human, I guess you could say, kinship, or it's sort of the lowest common denominator of what renders a human kin with anything or any being that's created. So it's a bit like saying instead of human beings, just beings, right?
Right.
It's taking away that human distinction.
Sure.
So I wonder if we want to talk a little bit more about the ways that the image of God, we've spoken about how it's valorized to some degree in ancient rabbinic sources, but then also has limited use and then becomes also much more Jewish supremacist in some contexts. I wonder if you want to talk about some of the ways that it's invoked other ways it's invoked in modernity or in contemporary instances. I can think of a few,
Sure.
maybe that are more to sort of on the right or conservative usages. One thing that comes to mind is sort of my favorite awful example of image of God is Hitler, who no one would think of Hitler as a kind of proponent. But actually, Hitler uses image of God language to castigate. what he called race mixing, and I'm using my fingers to kind of put quotes in because I don't. That's not a neutral term. That's an invented term. And his idea that the image of God, of course, is the kind of pure in that Nazi sense of purity, right? The pure kind of white Aryan. And Jews, Hitler said, are the incarnate insult to the beauty of God's image. And that he argued that the state has to propagate, a pure race and not, well, this is not a particularly original to Hitler. This is a kind of race science that you find in the States at the time earlier and in Germany. But the idea is you need to avoid race degradation or degeneracy. And that means that these sort of upright white Aryans cannot have children with either people of African descent or people of Jewish descent, because if they do so, they will sully the image of God and they will actually produce, he kind of uses the word like mishlings, like half humans and half animals. So there, here you start to also get at the way that it's a particularly egregious example, but the way that image of God does two things in my analysis. It is a tool against which people who are technically humans can be measured. So some humans are better copies, better images of God. And it's a tool of speciation, right? So not only does image of a God, humans in the image of God let you say that that beings who are not human are not in God's image, and then potentially they're negative or disposable. But also, some humans are not proper images of God. So that performs a boundary both between the human and the non-human, and then it often allows, in obviously more egregious examples, it allows people to discount certain humans as not having quite the right image. So gradations of imageness or humanity. That's the example that comes to mind as a kind of more modern invocation. Do you have any have you seen it being used outside of like liberal left circles in ways that you think, I mean, maybe not quite as tendentious as Hitler, but wondering if you've seen it used elsewhere.
I
Like,
mean,
did
I
you
think
grow up with it?
I think before we actually talk about this, I think we
Okay.
have to do some work about how it came to be this way. Hitler's kind of the end of the story, not really the beginning.
Sure.
And I think that from the very beginning, in the Mishnah that you quoted, for example, with the notion of humans being created in the image of God, comes the naturalization of hierarchy, both between humans and humans towards other species.
Yeah.
And so when early biblical interpreters try to understand what is this image of God, as early as Philo, we have Philo telling us it's reason, it's the soul, it's the mind. And there's a through line really from Philo through today where you see Jewishly, we could look at Philo, we could look at Maimonides, who
Hmm.
identify the Tselem Elohim as specifically mind or reason.
Right.
Or we could look at Christian interpreters like Augustine, who tells us that actually the image of God isn't just reason, but it's related also to this notion of free will. And
Hmm.
therewith comes other distinctions:
Right.
God superior to human, humans superior to animal, men superior to women, et
Mhm.
cetera,
Well,
et
that
cetera.
men superior to women is where you start to see another example of how this the image of God is bound up with humanness in ways that differentiate not just between the human and the non-human, but among humans. So some humans are more accurate copies. And the examples you're giving about reason, sometimes it's right, it's logos, it's freedom of choice, right? It can also be speech, I guess,
Yes, you have
philosophy,
that.
right?
So you have that in UNCLOS would be one
Mhm.
example, which translate Selam Elohim as this notion of Ruach Memalala, the ability to speak. But again, this is this notion of something non-physical
Yes,
that is bequeathed exclusively to humans.
right. And
But
I
again,
find
the
it
speech,
wonderful.
Right. And the speech there makes sense if you think
Yeah.
about it. Well, in that tradition, you can't see God, but we certainly hear God because God has a lot to say.
Okay,
Right. So
now wait.
if there's something in which we're like God, according
Yeah.
to that tradition, it must be speech. But before we get to where I
Wait,
think
no,
you
I
want
want
to
to
go,
rewind you. I want to rewind you, actually. I want to put a pause 1 second because you said some really important things. Because you've pointed out Jewish traditions, and there are Christian ones too, that metaphoricize image. And that's really important because you pointed out that the extent to which they're literal, they move from image to speech, which is sound, because there is a contradiction between the idea that humans are in the image of God and certain Jewish ideas that God cannot be seen. So Maimonides,
ideas, medieval Jewish ideas, right? This isn't a concern.
Philo also
Philo, sure, and Philo's coming out of the Platonic tradition. What I mean to say is
but
this
he's
is
still
not.
Jewish.
It's to emphasize that this is not a concern of the rabbis. The rabbis are
Okay.
not concerned with
Yes,
the idea that God has an image. That is
exactly.
a concern that really surfaces in medieval Jewish philosophy.
And I think that that concern actually dovetails nicely with a particular kind of moralization. So that humans have attributes, and the rabbis say this to some degree as well, the early rabbis, that the humans, that the image, the likeness, right, imageness, the sameness of humans to God resides in characteristics that are just not, that are not exclusively physical, for instance. So that, the most literal version of image of God is, you want to know what God looks like? Hi, it me. And the most metaphorical is, God doesn't have a body. God cannot be perceived or seen. And there are biblical traditions that say, for example, that when God says, when I spoke to you on Mount Sinai, you saw nothing. There in Deuteronomy, there's actually an explicit linkage between the idea, you saw nothing and you shall not make images of me, because there's nothing to see. Right. And so I wanted to say that there are contradictory traditions going back to the Bible, where on the one hand, God has a body, he has feet, right? He has the form of of a man, as you pointed out. And there are traditions that say God is just incomprehensible and invisible beyond human perception. Now you can interrupt me.
No, I was just going to. I actually want to state
Hmm.
explicitly, right? So, in a tradition, in a biblical tradition that has a ban on physical representations of the deity, it tells us that actually the only legitimate representations of the deity are human beings. All humans, in a sense, in that tradition, are knockoffs of God,
I
and I
like
think
knock.
they're knockoffs, right? And I think
Right.
that's important. And I think there's that it's a powerful idea. It's a powerful idea that can lead to very dangerous ideas. But I do think we should just state very clearly, like the language of tselem and demut, which are used in Genesis, are iconographic terms, right?
Yes, I mean it means literally,
Image.
image. It could be like, a painting, a sculpture. In that sense, it's referring to representational, some kind of artistic product. And that actually there you do see, whether you want to talk about it as a metaphor or a very literal thing, God is sometimes described by the early rabbis as an image maker, an icon painter. And so there is this material understanding. Go ahead. That kind of
Which is
flesh and blood.
emphasized,
Yeah.
yes, which is emphasized by the forming of human from the earth in a kind
A
of
clay-like sculpture.
clay-like forming that one would precisely how one might make a certain kind of icon or a certain kind of sculpture.
Mhm.
And so humans become that the only legitimate knockoffs or icons of God. But now let's go back to the dark side, right? You were saying you asked,
I
but
mean, that might be the dark side.
that might be
I feel like that is the problem,
that is
right?
the dark side.
And I just want to say, I want to push back. I do think that the Bible, Hebrew Bible, is not uniformly iconophobic. There exist anti-image traditions, but you could argue that the Bible preserves, again, plenty of traditions that not only see that God has a body, but potentially, for example, the idea of the cherubim being built in the.
I
So there
think
are these kind of sculptural, there is a kind of, idolatry images, but there's also clearly traditions of potential celebration of representation and so on.
So forms of representation. What is clear is that it dislikes the representations of all
yes,
non-sanctioned like it's
yes,
really what the only thing that can be represented is what I tell you can be
right.
represented and all the others can't, right?
Well,
So
God
that's
says, I'm a jealous God. I mean, I actually feel like that's actually very good. He's like, listen, we can't be poly, okay? It's like the Exodus. Okay, honey, we can't be poly because I'm jealous. So please don't have any other lovers besides me.
and
I
that
mean, he
becomes
doesn't, I
really
don't know if God says
literal
it in
when
that
he
voice. Yes.
he does. Well, it becomes really literal when he
Mm.
actually has a prophet go out
And call,
and commission a sex worker, right? And engage
yes.
and in order to prove, to show to Israel that they themselves were being unfaithful. So
But wait,
it is
you were,
Oh, yes, the liberal, yes. So you asked about more conservative invocations. I mean, I think that it's not just Jews who would see themselves or others would see as liberal progressive parts of Judaism. I actually think there's a segment of kind of conservative Jewish thought that is so invested in trying to demonstrate a Jewish contribution to so-called Western civilization
mm,
that they'll often, let's say, point to the Declaration of Independence, which tells us that man, like all men are
mhm,
created are equal, and of course we know men in the Declaration of Independence and in the constitution, its invocations of this same idea in the Constitution really just mean man, white man, to the exclusion of indigenous peoples, black people, and women, right?
mhm,
So that very invocation was always already
mhm,
exclusionary and based upon a social hierarchy. So I always find that interesting that more conservative elements want to trumpet that.
mhm,
And so I think that would be a place that I see that, not just
mm,
exclusively on in circles of liberal and progressive Jews, who
right.
I must say I love the work that they're doing and that they're putting that idea towards. And I also think we need to recognize the ways in which it's been used throughout history. Jews also have been used as not just in Hitler, but if you look philosophically, where in a philosophical tradition that wherein the image of God is taken to be the soul or mind or reason, Jews have been excluded from possessing that reason or the right kind
Oh,
of
sure.
reason, right? So Bruno Bauer uses that idea, telling us Jews don't have reason, in order to level his attack on efforts for Jewish emancipation. Jews don't have the right kind of reason, and therefore
Mhm.
they're not worthy of full civil rights.
Right. And I will say that actually you see this in with the rabbis. So, for example, there is this ancient Jewish ritual called seeing or a vision ritual, which was done 3 times a year on the festivals. And it's the rabbis understand that for this in this ritual, Jewish men would go of age, that is, full age Jewish men would come to the temple and would see God, and they're very clear, would see God and be seen by God. And they kind of understand that there's this sort of almost mirror like, it's a really fascinating ritual because, in a certain sense, it doesn't, they don't talk about humans in the image of God, but that ideology informs it because the rabbis, and actually the Bible seems to sort of talk about this too. The rabbis, though, make it very clear that these Jewish or Israelite men come to see God and to be seen by God. And so, what do they derive from this idea of almost like a visual reciprocity? Therefore, you people who do not conform to this mirror image are excluded. Children, people with disabilities, amputees, people who are deaf mute, elders, women, enslaved people, and of course, non Israelites. So, what you end up with is actually something in which, on the one hand, how cool, right? You have this idea of mutuality and reciprocity and a kind of theophoric, like theophanic, right? A visual manifestation and revelation of God and human. But when you take that really literally and you do exactly what you were describing, you say, well, that means that God has a body, a penis, 2 legs, right? Walks, hears, speaks. Then you end up just excluding all those who don't look like that. So you already see that in third-century rabbinic texts. And so there are ways that I think maybe I'll come out and be more direct and normative. There are ways both within the Jewish tradition and about, as you pointed out, Jews themselves, exclusions that are sexist, racist, and ableist. And so I think that often, something has to be acknowledged. That has to be acknowledged. Like that comes with the package. The question is it inevitable? And I guess my final kind of question to you, Gilah, is in the age of the Anthropocene and climate catastrophe, are we not ripe for an alternative way of thinking about kinship and justice beyond the human? We're going to Briot creations. Is that not a better foundation for theologically motivated visions of justice?
Well, I'm actually going to push back and actually
Excellent.
say something I don't think you're expecting me to say, which is that
Cool.
absolutely I am all for in this moment as ever of climate catastrophe and recognizing the ways in which we are always already imbricated with non-human animals and all sorts of different forms of life that literally inhere in us and make us who we are. And I also think because you invoke global heating and climate catastrophe, that the emphasis in certainly in certain circles of theory and
Mm.
philosophy that really emphasize the ways in which we humans are just like everything else, I
Mm.
think actually makes it harder to address climate change and global heating
I
because
didn't
it
say, I
also
didn't, that's not
because
necessary to say
because
that. Yeah.
because it can elide the ways in which humans uniquely have are responsible for the situation in which we're in. And I think one could, if they wanted to, lean on the tradition of Tselem Elohim, of human beings having a certain kind of agency and a certain kind of status and use of reason, one could say, you use that actually to inform a certain kind of responsibility and obligation. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of that midrash where God shows shows Adam the entire world and basically says, don't mess this up because there's nobody else who will come and fix it after you. So I do think people, proponents of Tselem Elohim, could lean on that. On the other hand, I absolutely think it's important to recognize the human supremacy inherent in human beings in Tselem Elohim, the notion that humans are created in the image of God. And I think it's important to just name that since Xenophanes, many philosophers have pointed out the narcissism in that belief. That I think Xenophanes said that if cattle or horses or lions had hands, they would draw God in their image. And
I think
Spinoza
that I
says
think
a
that I,
similar
I hear what
thing
you're
as
saying. I,
well.
I want to interrupt you just because I want to go back and I want to say that I agree with some of the things you just said. I never said humans are like everyone else.
I
That
didn't
is,
say you
no, no,
did.
no, 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 no. No, let me finish my sentence. You said the problem with saying that humans are like, you can go back into the transcript.
I
They
didn't
talk
say
about,
you were saying that.
right. But let me finish. That is a not best faith version of the argument. A better faith version is, and I certainly don't, I'm not saying humans are like everyone else. So I think there's a way to say that we can do better than the idea of humans being in the image of God. And, I don't know that I need God necessarily to inform my idea about ethics and action in climate catastrophe. But for those who do, to say that beings are all creations doesn't make all beings alike. You can have heterogeneity and diversity, even if you say that all creations are endowed with sanctity. So I think we don't need to make that's not a logical necessity. Humans don't need to, and every being has agency of its kind, and each kind needs to take responsibility. I don't know that you need image of God to say that humans, the worry I have with using image of God is that it's sounding dangerously like a very patronizing custodian theology, that the human is what's the word? The caretaker, the one with reason because yeah, and I think that that is not necessary in order to say that humans bear responsibility for their actions.
But I do think it's important to emphasize that that very reason has led to this situation to begin
Exactly.
with. This hallowed reason
Right.
and so-called progress and technology are the ones
Yes.
that have actually had human beings be responsible for the climate catastrophe. And I was simply suggesting that is sometimes elided. That's all. That sometimes it is of the disproportionate responsibility that humans and their so-called reason carry for the situation is sometimes, and I don't need to start naming all the theorists who I think make this mistake, but one example would be Jane Bennett, that is sometimes lost when people want to make human beings
I
like
see.
everybody
Right.
else. I'm not saying that's what
Right.
you were doing.
No,
But
no.
I think
Yes.
it can
I
in
see
some
what you're
ways
saying.
be counterproductive
I
because
see.
obviously humans are much more responsible for global heating than any other.
Right. But I was talking, but specifically as a way to think about human responsibility. Obviously, we're not going to use it. We're not going to, yeah,
I agree,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think sometimes it's okay to be a little patronizing if that might actually inspire some people. Right? I think a little
What you're saying,
paternalism, I'm not saying this does that work for me.
but
that
you're
I
saying
need.
in a way you're being paternalistic towards
Yes,
people.
I am. Yes,
You're saying
I was hoping you would pick up on that.
you were saying that you need to flatter people and tell them you're special because you're human, and you need to flatter them in order to get them to do the right thing, which is actually the right thing is in fact to remember that you're not the only ones here, and that you're not as special as you think, and you
And I
have
would say,
responsibility towards non-humans.
in so doing that, I have lots of people to lean on in that tradition. If we've seen anything, definitely stretches back. So I'm not alone. I'm not alone in that.
I see that it's a pragmatic move, but I still find it. I guess I wouldn't, if I were educating a small person, I would want not to. I would find. I guess I would find it pedagogically problematic to educate a child, for example, and form their sense of obligation, ground it in human
So
specialness.
I don't think that's, listen, I think that for certain people for whom Tselem Elohim is the fundamental asset that Judaism has to offer the world, I think that that is a problem. But where it's part of a plethora and a matrix of ideas, then I think that's a perfectly lovely addition. And so I agree with you where the distillation of Judaism and Jewish thought to that particular idea is not only misguided, it can be incredibly problematic. On the other hand, I think there's value to it when it comes along with a host of other ideas.
Ideally jostling side by side with completely contradictory ideas that are equally Jewish.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Do you feel that we've satisfied our inclination to argue a little more in this second episode? Have we scratched that itch or not? We haven't quite got there yet, Gilah.
Fortunately, Rufy, we've got 4 more episodes to hash that out. And I would just want to say that for those looking for more of some of these ideas, I strongly suggest Rafe's recent book, When a Human Gives Birth to a Raven.
And I'm going to return the compliment by saying if you want a philosophical, reasoned take that is logical and not hysterical,
yes,
please do read the almost hot on the press book by Dr. Gilah.
In the press. No, it's hot on the press.
It's actually on the press being heated as we speak. Sovereignty Disrupted, Spinoza and the Disparity of Reality. Especially read the parts about the naturalization of hierarchy. You're going to love that. And the perils of anthropomorphism.
That's right.
This has
and
been
anthropocentrism.
Oh, yes, the worst. This has been a fabulous conversation, Gilah. Thank you for listening, everyone. Until next time. Thanks for listening to Aderaba. Music was written and recorded by Dali Muru and the Polyphonic Swarm. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to rate the show and leave a comment. It really helps others find us. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, where you can watch clips from episode recordings. And if something in today's episode got you thinking, sparked a new question, or made you want to keep the conversation going, share it with a friend. That's how ideas spread. You can also follow us on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Until next time, thanks for being part of the conversation.